My name is Daniel Skyhawk, 41 years old, and this happened to me back in 1994. I was living in a small, dusty town in northern Arizona, trying to scrape together a living after leaving the reservation. I worked at jobs, mostly in construction and landscaping. One day, I got a call from my buddy, Frank Tallman, about a gig fixing up an old cabin out in the middle of nowhere. The pay was decent, and I needed the money, so I agreed to help him out. The cabin was owned by a guy named John Stillwater, who had inherited it from his grandfather. John was a wiry man in his 50s, with a graying beard and a rough demeanor. He didn't talk much, but when he did, it was with a sharp, no-nonsense tone that made it clear he wasn't one for small talk. We met at a diner on the edge of town to go over the details. "This place hasn't been touched in decades," John said, sipping his black coffee. "It's falling apart, but I want to restore it." "You and Frank think you can handle it?" "Yeah, we've seen worse," Frank replied, glancing at me with a smirk. Frank was always the confident one, always ready to take on the next big project without hesitation. "Good. We'll head out tomorrow. It's about an hour's drive into the woods. You guys need anything, you let me know. But fair warning, it's pretty isolated out there. No self-service, no neighbors." "Sounds perfect," I said, trying to match Frank's enthusiasm. The next morning, we loaded up Frank's truck with tools and supplies and followed John's. The road quickly turned from pavement to dirt, winding through thick forest. The trees grew denser, and the sunlight struggled to break through the canopy. It felt like we were driving into another world. We finally arrived at the cabin, and John wasn't kidding when he said it was falling apart. The roof had holes, the walls were covered in moss, and the porch sagged under its own weight. But there was something about the place that felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but the air seemed heavier, the forest quieter. We got to work right away, tearing down the rotten boards and hauling debris. John mostly stayed out of our way, occasionally checking in to make sure we were on track. As the days passed, that strange feeling persisted. I noticed it in small things. A sudden drop in temperature, the way the trees seemed to close in around us, the eerie silence that settled over the cabin every evening. One night, after a long day of work, Frank and I were sitting on the porch, sipping beers and talking about nothing in particular. John had gone back to town to get more supplies, leaving us alone. "Hey, Charlie, you ever feel like you're being watched out here?" His voice low and serious. I nodded. "Yeah, it's weird, right? This place just feels wrong. Maybe it's just the isolation. We're not used to being this far from civilization." "Maybe," I said, though I wasn't convinced. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest grew darker and more menacing. We decided to call it a night and headed inside. The cabin had no electricity, so we relied on lanterns and flashlights. I lay in my sleeping bag staring at the ceiling, trying to shake the feeling of unease that clung to me. I must have drifted off at some point because I woke to the sound of something scraping against the wall outside. I sat up, heart pounding, and listened. There it was again, a slow, deliberate scraping, like something was trying to get in. I grabbed my flashlight and nudged Frank awake. "Frank, you hear that?" "Hear what?" he mumbled, still half asleep. "Listen." We both sat in silence, and the scraping came again. Frank's eyes widened, and he reached for his knife. "Stay here," he whispered, moving towards the door. "Are you crazy? We should wait until John gets back. We can't just sit here and do nothing. What if it's an animal trying to get in?" I reluctantly followed Frank to the door, flashlight in hand. We stepped outside, the cold night air biting at our skin. The forest was eerily quiet, and the moon cast long shadows across the ground. Every snap of a twig underfoot sounding like a gunshot in the silence. As we rounded the corner, my flashlight beam caught something moving near the wall. I froze, the light illuminating a figure hunched over, scratching at the wood with long, gnarled fingers. "What the hell is that?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The figure turned its head, and I felt a chill run down my spine. Its eyes were dark, empty voids, and its skin was pale and leathery. It let out a low, guttural sound that made my blood run cold. Frank didn't hesitate. He lunged at the creature with his knife, but it moved with an unnatural speed, darting away into the shadows. We stood there, breathing heavily, trying to process what we had just seen. His voice shaky. "I don't know, but we need to get out of here. Now." We hurried back inside, barricading the door as best we could. We sat there in the darkness, clutching our makeshift weapons, waiting for the dawn. Neither of us got any sleep that night, and when John returned the next morning, we told him everything. John listened quietly, his expression grim. "You're not the first to see it," he said finally. "My grandfather used to tell stories about a creature that roamed these woods. He called it the Hetaliai, the witch doctor. Said it was a spirit that could take on different forms, and it fed on fear." Frank and I exchanged uneasy glances. "So, what do we do?" I asked. "We finish the job and get out of here." John replied, "I don't believe in ghosts, but I do believe in getting paid." We continued working on the cabin, but the atmosphere was tense. Every sound, every shadow put us on edge. We never saw the creature again, but we could feel its presence lurking just out of sight. One evening, as we were packing up for the day, Frank went to check on the generator we'd been using for power tools. He didn't come back. I waited, calling his name, but there was no response. I grabbed my flashlight and headed out to find him. The generator was still running, but Frank was nowhere to be seen. I called out again, my voice echoing through the trees. Panic set in as I searched the area, but there was no sign of him. It was like he had vanished into thin air. I ran back to the cabin, heart racing. "John! Frank's gone!" John grabbed his rifle and followed me outside. We searched the woods, calling Frank's name, but it was no use. As the sun set, the forest grew darker and more foreboding. We had no choice but to return to the cabin and wait until morning. That night was the longest of my life. Every creak, every rustle, set my nerves on edge. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that whatever took Frank was out there, waiting for its next move. At first light, we resumed our search. Hours turned into days, but there was no trace of Frank. The authorities were called, and a formal search was conducted, but it yielded nothing. Frank Tolman had disappeared without a trace. With heavy hearts, John and I finished the work on the cabin. We didn't speak much, the weight of Frank's disappearance hanging over us. When the job was done, I packed up my things and left that cursed place behind. Years have passed since then, but I still think about Frank. I wonder what happened to him, if he's still out there somewhere, or if the Hatali I got him. I've told this story to a few people, but most don't believe me. They say it's just a tale, a figment of my imagination. But I know what I saw, and I know what I felt. Some nights, when the wind howls through the trees and the shadows seem to move, I think back to that cabin in the woods. I think of Frank and the creature with the empty eyes, and I wonder if it's still out there, lurking in the darkness, waiting for its next victim. This was years ago now, but I remember it. I remember all of it. I loved the forest and I loved hunting, but not anymore. That night the moon was full, but the trees choked its light. Streams of silver fought for every inch, peeking through the canopy. Footfalls in the forest echoed, the crunch of leaves and the snapping of twigs announcing my presence. I wasn't lost, but I hadn't found what I'm looking for. Earlier that day, I shot a deer. It felt wrong. That's the best way to explain it. Just wrong. I had no luck, sitting in my stand for hours. Then it walked out of the tree line, a huge buck. It strolled right to the center of the clearing, its head pivoting side to side and then up. It was looking straight at me. I took aim, lining up my crosshairs on the deer. A voice in the back of my head whispered, "Don't do it." Why, I thought. Just don't take the shot. the voice insisted. I lined up my crosshairs again. The deer, unblinking, glassy black eyes staring up at me. Why isn't it running? My chest started to tighten. I don't know, but don't do it, the voice persisted. I curled my finger around the trigger and began to squeeze. No, don't shoot that deer, the voice screamed in my head. I knew I shouldn't have pulled that trigger, but I did. God, what I'm saying doesn't even make sense, but it's what I saw. It's what I did. I shot that deer and it didn't budge. It took that bullet between the shoulder blades like a mosquito bite. It flicked its ear, licked its nose, turned its head and walked back to the gap between the trees, vanishing. I climbed down from the tree stand and approached the spot where I'd shot the deer. There was blood, but it wasn't right. The wound I'd made in the deer's chest was mere moments ago, yet the blood on the ground was already clotted and dried. I followed the blood trail into the trees. The smell, God, the smell was horrible, like the stench of swamp mud and rot. Something was off, but I had to track it. My dad instilled in me strong hunting ethics. Know your gun, shoot only when certain, and always track down wounded game. I can't explain why I felt the way I did. Watching it walk back into the woods made my stomach drop. But why? It wasn't a deer. It saw you. It took that bullet like a slap on the back. Then what was it? I don't know, but it wasn't a deer. The forest around me was alive with the sounds of summer, the chirping of crickets, the hoot of an owl, frogs joining the chorus on cue. Everything was in motion. I followed the blood trail, refusing to give up for the night. I had to find it. Suddenly the blood trail stopped at the base of a large tree. The blood had been heavy and constant up to this point. I scanned the area with my flashlight, but there was nothing. Where could it have gone? Then something thick and sticky struck my forehead. I reached up, touched it, and brought my fingers into the light. Red. Blood. I shone my light up the tree, and there it was. Halfway up the trunk, blood. Further up, on one of the branches, more blood. What the heck? That's not possible. I tried to rationalize. Had the deer succumbed to its injuries and been dragged up the tree by something? No, there wasn't enough blood for that. And there were no remains. How did blood get up in the tree? It must be from another wounded animal, not the one I'm tracking. Perhaps I got swapped onto its trail instead. No, it can't be. I know I've been tracking the same trail the whole time. The only explanation is that the deer, that thing I shot, scaled this tree. Deer don't climb. So where is it now? I shone my light into the treetops, but there was nothing. The branches were bare, no sign of life anywhere. Well, crap. Now what? I decided to make camp since the trail was dead and there was nothing left to track. I set up my tent and gathered some wood for a fire beneath the tree. I tried to get some rest, but sleep wouldn't come. I kept replaying the events from earlier over and over again. The more I thought about it, the less anything made sense, and the less sense things made, the more threatened I felt. I sat up, stoked the fire, and grabbed my weapon. I was ready to fight. Maybe not to win, but to fight. "What are you doing?" a voice in my head asked. "I just want to be ready," I replied. "Ready for what?" the voice persisted. "I'm not sure, but it makes me feel better." "No, you know." "Know what?" "You shouldn't have shot that deer." Sitting by my fire, I remained at the ready, constantly scanning the area and listening to every sound the forest threw at me. The night was loud. The forest was alive with creatures, all caught in a perpetual state of hunting or hiding. Then, faintly, I heard a snapping sound. I turned and raised my gun toward the void. The orange glow of the fire danced on the barrel, illuminating the campsite but revealing nothing beyond. I decided not to use my flashlight. I wanted complete control of my weapon. Motionless, I sat, listening intently. Nothing, just the crackling of the fire. Yeah, that's all it was, I told myself. Nothing there. I knew that wasn't true, but it was the only thing I could say to convince myself to lower the gun. The night dragged on, but I survived. despite the occasional kamikaze moth pelting me. As dawn broke, the cool morning air, tinged with a light blue hue, enveloped the forest. It was a welcome change from the heat that lay ahead. A thick fog had rolled in. I extinguished the remnants of the fire, packed my gear, and prepared to head to the pickup location. My friend wouldn't be able to get me for another day, but at least I'd be ready. I squatted down to retrieve my packed bag, slinging it over my shoulders in one swift motion. The swirling fog parted where the bag had lain, revealing something I hadn't noticed before. Tracks. Not just any tracks. Deer tracks. Hundreds of them. The hoof prints struck deep into the damp ground around the campsite, forming a perfect circle around my camp. This thing had circled me all night long, just beyond the light of the fire. But that couldn't be. I would have heard something. I mean, there were hundreds of tracks. It would have had to make noise at some point. Upon further inspection of the formation, it became apparent there were no tracks showing entry or exit from the area. It was like the deer had materialized right beside the campsite and then vanished. Forget this. I am out of here, I muttered to myself as I began the long trek to the pickup location. However, I decided not to stop there. I'd hike down the logging road to the mouth of the main dirt road that my buddy would have to drive down to get to the meetup spot. Honestly, it didn't do much in getting me out of here any sooner, but it was good to have a mission to work towards. Any amount of time shaved off in these woods was better. Most of the hike was uneventful. I was approaching well over halfway to the meeting spot when I decided it was time for a break. I rummaged around in my bag for water and a protein bar. I was making great time. At this rate, a few more hours of hiking, and I would be on the logging road in no time, and only a half-hour hike from the main dirt road. Snap! A branch popped behind me. Lifting my gun and swinging around to the noise in one fluid motion, I scanned the area behind me. The forest is thick this time of year, so my view of my surroundings is limited. This thing could be mere feet away, and I wouldn't see it. The iron sights of my rifle glided across the forest, and then I stopped. I saw something, a big patch of brush, but something was off with it. At the top of a large bush, there were weird branches coming out, oddly bare. No, not branches, antlers. My hands tightened around my weapon as I pulled its buttstock tight against my shoulder. Tunnel vision kicked in. I saw nothing aside from the bush. Then I guessed where the head would be relative to the exposed antlers. I took aim and squeezed the trigger. The kick of the gun jolted my insides. A loud, thunderous bang ripped through the forest, followed by the burnt smell of gunpowder. It didn't even flinch. No movement at all from this thing. The tips of its antlers were still visible. Then, the exposed point slowly lowered down and out of sight into the brush. Everything was still. Everything was quiet. Everything was wrong. I grabbed my bag and began to run, as fast as the forest would let me, towards the direction of the logging road. Tearing through the woods, between the snapping and whipping of vines and branches, I could swear I heard something tailing me. But I didn't care. I just wanted out. So, I kept running. I burst through the thicket and into open air, the resistance of the forest vanishing and toppling me forward onto the dusty red earth. An orange cloud surrounded me as I slid across the dirt road. I rolled over, facing where I had exited the tree line, chest heaving, waiting for that thing to rip through the foliage and jump on me. But as I sat on the road, gun up, nothing came out of the woods. It was still. I think I'm losing my freaking mind. I lifted myself up from the dirt, brushed off my clothing, and gathered my bearings. It's this way. I started down the dirt path, hiking for a few minutes before a section of cleared forest came into view on the right side of the path. It was an old logging site. Stumps jutted up like headstones in a tree graveyard. The clearing was littered with the tracks of trucks and the branches of past harvests, a wide-open expanse of mangled wood and debris. This is as far as I go for now. The sun will be going down in a few hours, and there's no point in going further. Plus, this will make a great spot for camp. The best part about it is plenty of firewood, an open view of my surroundings, and the ground is completely littered with branches, so I'll hear it coming. No trees mean no cover for it from my shots. Yeah, this is as good as it gets. One last night, and then my buddy should be here first thing in the morning to get me. Just one more night. For the last time, I set up camp, stacked a quick pile of firewood, and stood guard as the sun dipped below the horizon. The night crept in from the forest around me. I could sense I wasn't alone. The feeling had been lingering before dusk, but now it was closer, more persistent. The hours passed slowly. The wind was relentless, constantly threatening to snuff out my flames. I kept shifting my position to shield the fire with my body, but it was barely enough to keep it lit. The darkness was thicker than the night before, with no moon or stars, only clouds blanketing the sky and its light. It was quieter tonight. There were no sounds of bugs or animals, just the rustling trees and howling wind. Time dragged on with nothing happening. Dawn was just a couple of hours away. I made it, I thought. Maybe I'm losing my mind. Then I saw it, a silhouette approaching my camp. The fire cast a faint glow, but I couldn't make out any details. It looked like my buddy. Maybe he's ahead of schedule and was drawn by the light of my fire. I stood up to greet him but froze mid-stride as the figure moved closer, the darkness around it melting away. It wasn't my buddy. It wasn't even a man. The legs were too skinny, the arms hung at odd angles, and what looked like long hair rose from its shoulders in writhing lines above its head. As it stepped into the light, I saw it clearly, every horrifying detail. It was that deer, but not a deer, not at all. This thing continued walking straight toward me. It moved on its hind legs, like a man. The forearms, now drooping in front of its body, ended in claws instead of hooves. Its jaw hung loosely on its hinge, revealing rows upon rows of jagged, malformed teeth. Its antlers now more resembled tentacles, whipping the air around it, and its eyes, no longer on the sides of its head, had shifted to the center of its face, one atop the other. I raised my gun, took aim, and then something from the sky hit my hand, then my cheek. It ran down my face and off my chin. It had started to rain. The sky opened up, unleashing a downpour that extinguished my fire in seconds, plunging me into darkness. The last sight I had of this thing was it advancing on me. I fired my gun into the dark. The flash from the discharge revealed nothing of its location, but I saw my flashlight on the ground to my left. I could hear nothing over the ringing in my ears from the shot. Even the beating of the rain was lost to me. Keeping my gun raised, I bent down with one arm outstretched, feeling around the ground for the flashlight, until I touched the familiar smoothness of plastic against the rough earth. I grabbed it, and as I did, I felt fur brush against my outstretched arm. I swung the gun in that direction and pulled the trigger. The recoil threw the gun from my hand, and I felt something warm and sticky splatter across my face. Clutching the flashlight, I dug my feet into the ground and pushed off into a sprint. I clicked on the light and picked a direction, the rain beating against my face, washing sweat into my eyes, making them sting. Each falling droplet obscured more of my light, leaving me barely enough visibility to keep my footing. I ran and ran until my eye hit even ground, the light illuminating the muddy path of the dirt road. I continued down the path until I lost my footing, sliding in the mud. The flashlight bounced ahead of me, landing with its beam pointed back in the direction I had come from. I rolled over onto my back and saw a tall, shadowy figure running up the path toward me. Scrambling to my feet, I left the light where it lay and let my instincts guide me. I didn't stop running until my footsteps slapped against pavement. I had made it all the way to the main highway. The sun was beginning to rise over the trees. I walked along the side of the road until I heard a familiar voice call out behind me. "Hey!" I stopped and turned to see my buddy half hanging out the window of his truck, a look of concern and confusion on his face. "What the heck happened to you?" he asked, hopping out of the driver's side door. I paused and just stared at him, unsure of how to explain. How could anyone understand? I finally said the only thing that made any sense. I shot a deer. It was my third week as a ranger in Yosemite, back in '78. Fresh out of the academy, a little green, but not too bad at figuring out trails. Plus, let's be honest, who couldn't get used to those views every day? It wasn't the glorious peaks or waterfalls that got me, though. I liked the quiet of Yosemite Valley, the way you could hear birds even with the folks milling around, the thick smell of the pines. That was my jam. The weirdness started with Gary. Old Gary was a park hand, been around since like the park opened or something. Anyway, he found me checking the signage on Lower Yosemite Fall Trail. He usually kept to himself, so it was a surprise to see him out of his normal haunts. "Say, Ethan," Gary rasped, voice sounding rusty, "ever go back behind the falls?" "Nah, not really," I said, adjusting a loose sign. "Not much point when you get this view right here, right?" He cackled, this kind of wet, phlegmy sound. "Maybe not point for everyone," he muttered. "Maybe those falls hide more than water." Before I could ask more than water like what, Gary was gone. He moved quick for an old guy. Weird cat, I thought, chuckling to myself at the old-timer with his cryptic messages. But Gary's words stuck with me. I mean, he wouldn't have said something like that for nothing, right? Yosemite was big. You never knew what critters were lurking in the backcountry. Couple days later, I was taking stock of bear canisters at a campsite when I spotted a figure deeper in the woods. Now, folks wander off all the time, but there was a hunched strangeness to this one. Plus, they moved like they knew what they were doing, like maybe they shouldn't be back there. I shrugged, more on instinct than anything, and headed after them. The trees swallowed us right up, the only sound my boots on the trail and that figure shuffling ahead. Every once in a while they'd glance back. They couldn't see me well in the dim light, but they sensed someone was there. Then just as quick as they showed up, they were gone, like vanished into thin air. Back at camp, a sinking feeling gnawed at my guts. I shrugged it off, attributing it to my newbie jitters. That same night, though, I couldn't shake the image of what I'd seen, or rather, not seen, when the figure glanced back. Instead of eyes, there were just these deep, empty sockets. It wasn't an illusion of light. I knew that much. The next few days went by in a blur. Routine patrols, fixing signs, standard ranger stuff. But those empty eyes haunted me. It's funny how your brain works, isn't it? You think you're tough, all prepared, but then something real weird comes along, and you're back to sleeping with the light on. Me? I couldn't shake this feeling that something was watching me, a presence in the trees just lurking. I was starting to spook myself. Then came the call late one night. It was Gary on the park radio, his voice shaking like a leaf. "Ethan, it's back. God help me, it's back," he gasped. The thing behind the falls, it took Davy. Who's Davy? I wanted to ask, but then it hit me. Davy was one of the seasonal guys, young kid full of jokes and energy. And now gone? Gary's voice cut through the static, frantic and desperate. "We gotta find him, Ethan. Please, I can't let it take anyone else." The line went dead. Adrenaline surged through my veins, fear replaced with a grim determination. Gary wasn't one to blow things out of proportion. Something was wrong, seriously wrong. It took me half an hour to get to the base of Lower Yosemite Fall. The moon barely cut through the thick canopy of trees, making the forest eerie and disorienting. Gary's pickup sat there, abandoned, headlights still on. I grabbed my flashlight, scanning the woods for any sign of him or Davy. My heart pounded in my ears, every rustle a potential threat. "Gary?" I shouted into the dark, but only echoing silence answered me. I moved deeper into the forest, flashlight beam flickering over the trail leading towards the waterfall. Even amidst the panic, I couldn't help but take a breath. The waterfall roared into the night, mist swirling up, catching the moonlight like an ethereal veil, and then a flicker of movement in the mist near the base of the falls. Instinctively, I ducked behind a boulder, my heart pounding a deafening rhythm in my ears. Peeking out, I could make out a dark shape near the water's edge. It was tall, too tall, and unnaturally thin. It moved with a jerky, inhuman grace, its limbs impossibly long and spindly. It stood there for a moment, seemingly unaware of my presence. "Davy?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. The creature whipped around, the movement so fast it almost looked like a glitch in reality. The darkness concealed most of it, but I could still make out its outline. A long, withered body, arms reaching almost to the ground, and where its head should have been, there was nothing but a smooth, featureless expanse. The creature lurched toward me, its movements jerky and unsettling. A wave of nausea washed over me as a stench like rotting flesh flooded the air. I raised my flashlight, the beam hitting the creature square in its chest, but it seemed unfazed. It moved so fast I barely had time to react. I felt a sharp blow to my hand, sending my flashlight spinning into the darkness. Pain exploded in my wrist. A bone-chilling shriek pierced the air as the creature lunged. I scrambled backwards, my eyes desperately searching the darkness for my flashlight. I tripped over a root, landing hard, the creature's hot, fetid breath washing over me. I fumbled in the dark, finally finding the flashlight. Hitting the power switch, I directed the beam right at the creature. An ear-splitting shriek reverberated through the forest, and the creature recoiled, its skin burning where the beam hit it. I grabbed hold of a fallen branch and swung, my clumsy blow making contact with the creature's shoulder. It let out another chilling scream, stumbling back with a force that shook the ground beneath me. Time seemed to slow down as I stumbled for my dropped gun, fingers fumbling like I'd never handled a weapon before. The stench of decay was overwhelming, making me gag. Finally, my hand closed around the grip, my trembling fingers flicking the safety off. The creature was regaining its footing, its form blurring in the darkness as it lunged again. I fired once, twice, the deafening shots echoing through the forest. The creature screeched, a sound that made my blood run cold, then staggered backwards, clutching at its chest where the bullets had pierced its withered flesh. With every step it took, a dark, viscous trail followed. A flicker of light caught my eye. Gary. He was stumbling out of the woods, clutching at a makeshift torch and a rifle. "Ethan, behind you!" he yelled, his voice hoarse. I spun around, but the creature had vanished. The only trace it had left behind was the inky liquid seeping into the ground. Gary lowered his rifle, his breath ragged. "That thing," he gasped. "It ain't natural, Ethan. I know, Gary." The events of the night crashing over me like a wave. We made our way back to the pickup, the silence broken only by our labored breathing and the crunch of leaves beneath our boots. I felt a strange hollowness inside of me, like something fundamental had shifted within. Gary slumped into the driver's seat, exhaustion etched on his face. "Gotta get word out," he muttered. "More Rangers. Need backup. Can't let it take others." He started the engine, the headlights slicing through the darkness. As we pulled away, I couldn't help but look back at the base of the falls. The mist danced and swirled, concealing whatever secrets might lay hidden within. The rest is a blur. The frantic radio calls, the arrival of a full team of Rangers, and the search that lasted days. We found Davy's remains tucked into an unseen crevice near the falls, his body torn apart. The creature, however, vanished without a trace. It was as if it had been swallowed by the very earth itself. Officially, the case was filed as an animal attack, but I knew we all did, that what lurked in Yosemite's shadow was something far more sinister. Gary retired soon after. They say he moved up north, someplace remote. Some say the guilt was too much for him. Others whisper he hunts the creature still, obsessed with vengeance for his lost crewmen. As for me, they put me on leave, said I needed a break from the stress. Truth is, I'd seen things nobody should ever have to witness, and it changes a person. Years passed. I did go back to Yosemite eventually. I couldn't stay away from the mountains, but it was never the same. There's a chill in the air, a quiet late at night when the wind whispers through the pines. I swear I hear a shriek in the distance. a hollow, chilling sound that makes my blood run cold. The locals started whispering about the Shrieker of the Falls, a creature of shadow and myth. They tell tales of hikers vanishing into the mist, snatched by something unseen and monstrous. I stay silent, knowing the awful truth behind the legend. Maybe one day that thing will resurface from whatever dark hole it crawled into. And maybe one day, I'll be there to stop it. I owe Davy at least that much. Until then, all I can do is listen to those chilling whispers on the wind and remember the night I faced the unfathomable and barely survived. My name is Christopher Stormrider, 42 years old, and this is a story about a time when things went very wrong for me and a few others. It was in 2008, in a small, almost forgotten town in Wyoming called Encampment. I was working as a mechanic at the time, which suited me just fine. I liked working with my hands, fixing things, getting dirty, and there wasn't much that I couldn't fix. Encampment isn't the kind of place you'd find on a map unless you were looking for it. It's quiet, surrounded by mountains, and has a population of just under 500 people. People there know each other, for better or worse. For me, it was mostly for the better. I lived alone, didn't have many friends, but I got along well with my neighbor Tom, who ran the local diner. We'd often spend our evenings talking about nothing in particular over a couple of beers. One evening, Tom told me about a series of disappearances that had been happening in the surrounding forests. Now, Wyoming has its share of missing hikers and hunters, but this was different. People who lived in the town their whole lives, who knew the land like the back of their hand, were vanishing without a trace. Was one of them. Tom had a wild theory that something was hunting people. I laughed it off, said he was spending too much time watching those ghost hunting shows. Life carried on as usual until one evening when I was at Tom's diner. It was late. The place was empty except for us. We were watching some old western on the TV when suddenly the lights flickered. Tom and I exchanged a glance, shrugged it off, and continued watching. The flickering stopped and we forgot about it until Tom went to close up and found the back door wide open. He swore he had locked it. Maybe it was the wind, I said, but we both knew better. That door had a heavy latch. No wind was going to open it. Tom decided to stay over at my place that night. We didn't talk about it, but I knew he was spooked. I didn't mind the company. The next day, news came that another person had gone missing. This time it was Edna, an elderly lady who lived alone on the outskirts of town. Her place was found empty, door wide open, a pot of stews still simmering on the stove. No signs of struggle, no footprints, nothing. It was like she had just walked out and disappeared into thin air. I started paying more attention to the stories Tom was telling me. We were both on edge. People in town were whispering, making up their own theories. Some said it was a wild animal. Others talked about ghosts. A few even suggested there was a killer among us. One night I couldn't sleep. It was around midnight and I decided to take a walk. It was cold, the kind of cold that bites through your jacket. As I walked past Edna's house, I saw something move in the shadows. I froze, squinting to see better, but there was nothing. I shook it off as my imagination turned around and went back home. A few days later, I had a late-night visitor. Tom banged on my door, pale and shaking. He said he had seen something in the woods behind his diner. I grabbed my shotgun. It wasn't loaded, but it made us feel better, and we headed out. We didn't see anything that night, but we both felt like we were being watched. The disappearances continued, and the town was in a panic. People were locking their doors. Kids weren't allowed to play outside, and anyone who could leave did. Those of us who stayed were left with a sense of dread. One evening, I was working late at the garage when I heard a noise outside. It sounded like a faint cry for help. I grabbed my flashlight and went to investigate. The sound was coming from the woods. Against my better judgment, I ventured in. I kept walking, calling out, but the cry stopped. Suddenly there was silence. I turned to head back when I saw it. A figure tall and gaunt, with eyes that seemed to glow in the dark. It moved fast, too fast for me to react. I stumbled back, falling over a log. By the time I got up, it was gone. I ran back to the garage, locked the doors, and called Tom. He came over, and we spent the night trying to make sense of what I saw. We both agreed it was something not natural, but what it was, we couldn't say. The next day, Sheriff Arnold came by. He was a tough guy, not easily rattled, but even he looked worried. He asked us to keep quiet about what we saw, said it would only cause more panic. He told us he was forming a search party to look for the missing people and asked if we join. We agreed. It wasn't like we had much of a choice. The search party consisted of me, Tom, Sheriff Arnold, and a few other townsfolk. We combed the woods for days, finding nothing but more questions. One of the guys, Bill, swore he saw something similar to what I described, but no one else did. Then, one night, it happened. We were camping out in the woods, taking turns keeping watch. It was my shift when I heard rustling in the bushes. I pointed my flashlight and saw it again, those glowing eyes. Before I could react, it charged at us. The camp erupted into chaos. People were shouting, firing their guns blindly into the dark. I managed to get a clear shot, but it didn't seem to do any good. The thing was fast, too fast. By the time the chaos died down, Bill was gone. We searched for him until dawn, but found no trace. Sheriff Arnold decided it was too dangerous to continue and called off the search. We headed back to town, defeated. Back in encampment, things got worse. More people went missing, and those who remained were too scared to leave their homes. Tom and I decided to take matters into our own hands. We armed ourselves with whatever we could find and set out to hunt the thing. We spent days tracking it, following the faintest of trails. Finally, we found its lair, a cave deep in the woods. We could smell it before we saw it, a false stench of decay. We entered cautiously, flashlights cutting through the darkness. The cave was littered with bones, some animal, some unmistakably human. Then we saw it. The thing was hunched over, gnawing on something. It looked up, eyes glowing, and let out a noise that sent chills down my spine. It charged at us. Tom fired first, hitting it in the shoulder. I followed, aiming for its head. It staggered but didn't go down, knocking Tom to the ground. I fired again, emptying my gun into it until it finally collapsed. We stood there, panting, staring at the lifeless body. It looked human but twisted, deformed. We dragged it out of the cave and burned it, not knowing what else to do. The disappearances stopped after that. Life and encampments slowly returned to normal, but the town was never quite the same. People who left never came back, and those who stayed never spoke about what happened. Tom and I kept our secret, telling ourselves it was for the best. We never talked about that night, but every now and then I catch him looking at the woods with a haunted look in his eyes. We survived, but we weren't the same. I still work at the garage, fixing cars, living my life. But every time I hear a noise in the woods, I wonder if there's something else out there, waiting. So that's my story. It's not a happy one, but it's the truth. I guess some things are better left buried in the past, forgotten like the town of encampment. But sometimes, late at night, I can still see those glowing eyes and wonder if we really killed it or just made it angry. There is one door at my old school before I graduated from middle school that was always locked. Not once did I see it open. There are many rumors about what lies on the other side of the door, such as an abandoned military bunker, a torture chamber, and my least favorite, another janitor's closet. Whenever I walked past the door, I always got this eerie feeling that I could not explain, but the feeling came as quickly as it disappeared. One day, as I was preparing to go home and about to leave school, I walked past the door, but this time I did not have the eerie feeling I had before. I turned my eyes towards the door to examine it, and I saw that there was a slight opening in the door. Out of curiosity, I waited until no one was around, and I stepped inside to investigate. I knew my mom would not mind if I was not home right after school because I usually go to one of my friends' house to play video games. To this very day, what I saw in that room still makes me wish I ignored the door and went home. It was pitch black as I entered the room. I looked for a light switch, but there was none, so I then pulled out my phone that was only at 10% and turned on the flash. The light from my phone revealed stairs that were carved from medieval stone bricks, the same as the walls. Curiosity struck me even harder, and I decided to walk down the stairs. As I walked down the stairs, the eerie feeling came back, and the further I went down, the stronger it became. I was halfway down the stairs when I heard a loud bang. I did not pay much attention to it, but I wish I had. I continued walking down and finally reached the bottom. I looked at my phone and saw I had only 5% left, and it had taken me 15 minutes to walk down the stairs. I shone the light from my phone to see that the stairs had led me to a long tunnel, lined with torches, with a wooden door at the end. In the corner of the tunnel, I saw a light switch, with my phone now at 4%. I turned my phone and flash off, and then flipped the switch. The torches turned on, and light illuminated the room. I walked through the long tunnel, and as I reached the door at the end, the eerie feeling faded away. I slowly opened the door so that only one eye could show. The room was so dark that the only thing I could see was a pedestal and something on the floor. I heard someone coming, so I opened the door and slowly closed it behind me. Then I ran to hide behind something in the darkness. Now that I was hidden, I could see that the something on the floor was cult-like, writing in red paint, or what I thought was paint. The doors opened, and two robed figures entered the room. One was dragging a long black garbage bag, and the other was holding some sort of book. The one dragging the bag stopped dragging it and entered the darkness. The one holding the book put it on the pedestal and yelled out, "You got the table yet?" "Almost," said the other. I examined the bag and saw that there was a pale hand poking out. Out of fear, I covered my mouth and waited until the one by the pedestal was distracted, and fearing that I would die, I silently walked to the door to escape. As I was just about to reach the door, the other robbed figure that was in the shadows grabbed me. "So, there was someone in here after all," said the figure in a raspy voice. "I guess so," said the other in a calm voice. "What are you going to do to me?" I yelled as I was trying to break free from the robbed figure's grasp, but it did not work. "It's not us you need to worry about. It's them," said the one beside the pedestal in a malicious tone. The lights turned on and illuminated the room to reveal two pale, 7-feet-tall human-like creatures standing. They had no eyes, no ears, only an extremely long, malicious smile and a crooked nose. The robed figure released his grasp on me and went to join his ally. I tried to move and get out of there, but my body was stuck, and I was paralyzed with fear. The human-like creatures started to approach me, and I fought to move my body. As I fought, I realized that while I was hiding in the darkness, I was actually hiding behind one of the creatures. One figure was now close enough that it stretched out his hand and nearly touched me. Before it could, I was able to break out of my paralyzed state and move. I opened the door and darted out of the room as fast as I could. I reached the stairs within seconds and looked back to see the figures running down the tunnel. I turned my head back towards the stairs and ran up quickly. I was halfway up the stairs when they let out an ear-piercing screech. I reached the top of the stairs to now realize the noise that I heard earlier was the door being closed. My heart was racing now. The door would not open. I pounded on it with all my might. Behind me, I could hear the creatures quickly approaching. Right when I thought all hope was lost, the door opened, and I darted out of there. I quickly closed the door shut and looked to thank whoever opened the door, but no one was there. A week later, a lot of staff and students were appearing to go missing, so the cops searched the school. When they opened the door and checked the room, nothing was there except for a letter on the pedestal saying, "We will find you, kid." Later that week, it was revealed that the door could have only been opened from the outside. That made me wonder, how exactly did the door open, because there was no one on the other side that could open it for me. A couple years have passed now. I have decided to write this to document what happened to me because I think they have found me. For the last week now, I have been sleeping with a 6-inch knife under my pillow because I have been seeing the creatures late at night in my room, hunched over my bed, maliciously smiling. I don't know how long I have left before they take me, but I won't go out without a fight. This happened to me and my cousins around a decade ago when I was 16, and my cousins were 13 and 10. We'll call them Bill and Ramon. We had gone on a camping trip with their dad, who I'll refer to as Roger, to the Appalachian wilderness and engaged in your average camping activities, like fishing, hiking, and sitting around campfires to tell ghost stories before turning in for the night. We had initially planned to stay out for longer than a week, which in the beginning was a very pleasant experience, marked by warm, sunny weather and breezy, starlit summer nights. However, around the 4th day, things started to take a turn for the strange and downright terrifying. It was in the evening and we were sitting around the fire, talking and laughing loudly, just your typical tumultuous adolescence. We roasted marshmallows while Roger was making dinner, when I decided to get a picture of myself standing in front of the dark woods holding a large brook trout that I had caught earlier that day. This detail will be important later. Around 11 p.m., the radio that had been playing suddenly began to falter into static, causing Bill to smack it repeatedly in a misguided attempt to get it back to work, which it didn't. An eerie silence overtook the campsite, only occasionally broken by the periodic crackling of the fire. Even the nocturnal choir of frogs and crickets had been completely extinguished, along with our own racket. I remember the tense feeling of being watched, as shivers ran down my arms and spine. Ramon, being the youngest, held on to his father, who tried to break the unsettling silence with an inappropriately cheerful, "Let's eat." We turned in soon after eating, though it was distinctly hard to sleep with the deafening silence and the persistent feeling of being watched still hanging over me. The next day started off well enough. Birds were chirping and the fresh morning breeze was gently swaying the leaves around us. We had breakfast and headed out for our planned hike. I was feeling much better than the night before and had set out looking forward to the woodland adventure. It was late in the afternoon when we finally stopped to eat lunch in a clearing, surrounded by the forest and its sounds. As we were eating, though, I felt goosebumps along my back and arms, just like last night, and the feeling of being watched overtook me. From the looks of it, Roger and my cousins were also overcome with an uneasy feeling. As if synchronized with our discomfort, the birds also halted their singing as silence befell our hike. Tense and tired, we decided to make our way back. The entire time, the dreadful feeling of being observed only growing as we approached the lake. Making our way down the hiking path and reaching the bank of the lake, we stopped when we heard a rustle in the distance. Roger held his hand up as if to motion us to stop and be quiet while he nervously scanned the vicinity. Again, we heard a rustle, only this time much more vigorous and seemingly closer, as if something were stalking us from within the tall grass nearby. Roger, who was holding a gun, was now on full alert, as he was expecting a black bear. His stance and seriousness frightened me as my cousins and I huddled together near Roger. We stood there for what seemed like an eternity until finally Roger decided the coast was clear. I had spent another restless night, haunted by silence. The following day, however, was the most fun I had the whole trip. In the morning, we had gone fishing out in the lake, and I caught another large fish, and after we spent the rest of the day swimming until late in the afternoon. We had arrived at the campsite around dusk, as I specifically remember the dramatic hues of orange and yellow that painted the sky in resplendent watercolor. Crickets and frogs were resonating their characteristic serenades as we approached, coming back from a day of fishing and swimming. We were laughing and stumbling as we carried our fishing gear down the trail, with Roger leading the way. Before we stepped into the campsite, Roger stopped dead in his tracks, causing me and my cousins to crash into him and each other, though he, a gargantuan man, didn't even seem to flinch. We looked at each other, baffled, and then we peeked out from behind him to find something which caused my legs to tremble in fear. There, right in the very center of our campsite, erected over the ashes of our long-extinguished campfire, was what I could only describe as the second most horrifying sight of my life. A grotesque effigy, apparently made of thousands of small twigs that had been banded together to form a torso and 4 limbs. At the end of both arms, twisted branched had been contrived into hands, and perched atop the torso was a large deer skull, which was seemingly smeared or painted with strange crimson-colored symbols. From its large, menacing antlers hung several small wooden trinkets fashioned into symbols which looked like the ones painted on the skull. After soaking in the dire situation, Roger snapped into action and gripped his gun, which had been swung over his shoulder. Like a drill sergeant, he ordered Bill and me to pack as much as we could as fast as we could while he started the truck, instructing us to leave anything heavy, including the tents. I had never moved so fast in my life. We left nearly everything non-essential as we haphazardly threw our belongings in the truck. Meanwhile, Roger was standing watch, gun ready, as Ramon was crying in the car. Shortly after, we sped away down the dirt path, surrounded by the soundless woods. A few days after arriving home, I had remembered about that photo I took with the brook I caught fishing. I wish I had never remembered about that photo. After downloading the pictures from my digital camera, I found the photo I was looking for. There I was, cheerfully holding my catch, illuminated by the warm light from the campfire. But something behind me had caught my eye, something I had missed while looking in the camera's screen. Hidden in the gloom of the dark forest was a faint glimpse of a partially illuminated head. After increasing the brightness on the image, I almost fell backward in pure terror. Right there, looking at me, was what appeared to be a menacing, human-like face, with ghostly white skin, dark, sunken eyes, a flared nose, and what appeared to be antlers protruding from both sides of its bald head. If the effigy it had left on our camp was the second most horrifying thing I've ever seen, this nightmarish photo would certainly take the first spot. One thing's for sure, I will never go camping like that again. The events described herein happened a long time ago, more than a decade in fact, but I still remember most of the details quite clearly. For a little bit of context, I was born and raised in a small rural town in the southeastern U.S., but at the time of this story, a sizable enclave of my family lived in the backwoods of the Upper Peninsula in Michigan. Once a year, my parents and I would pile into the car and make the trip up to see my Michigan relatives, and we would all converge on a small campground on the shores of Lake Superior for a 3 or 4 day reunion. I always looked forward to it, because it always meant several days of enjoying good, home-cooked food by the lakeshore with family. I especially loved seeing all of my cousins who were similar ages to me. Plus, most of the older family members would either be preoccupied with catching up on gossip or busy making casseroles and other dishes for the cookout. This meant that all of the kids were free to roam the beautiful shoreline of the lake, or go hiking in the woods, or just generally be free from our parents. It was a real blast. At the time that this story happened, I would have been 13 years old. Likewise, 2 of my cousins, Erica and Cody, were the same age as me, and another cousin named Dan was 2 years younger. Erica and Cody and I always hung out together at the reunion, since we were all the same age. The older cousins were too grown up to bother with us, but we were too old to be stuck with the little kids. Dan was in between. Too old for the kindergartners, but too young for us big and mature middle schoolers. He was funny and nice though, so we would usually let him hang with us. Anyway, on the first day of the reunion we did all of the usual running around and swimming, but we decided that this year we should do something more daring, since we were practically grown-ups now. To that end, we asked our cousin Bradley if there were any scary places nearby for us to explore. Bradley was kind of a jerk sometimes, but he was the youngest of the older cousins, so he was the most approachable. Besides, he was in ROTC at his high school and carried a pocket knife all the time, so he was pretty much as good as a space marine as far as we were concerned. Bradley acted annoyed at first, but eventually he caved and told us about a creepy abandoned farm that bordered the campground on one side. The fields were still used for growing wheat and corn, even though the house and equipment shed were run down and dilapidated. He told us a spooky tale of how the farmer who lived there had gone insane and started kidnapping local children and eating them. Of course, this story was completely made up just to scare us, but at the time, it sure seemed real enough to us. So, with visions of insane, fang-toothed cannibal farmers in our heads, we all decided this would be a great place to explore to show that we were fearless adults. We spent the rest of the evening biding our time, and once our parents were all asleep, we snuck out of our cabins and met at one of the picnic areas. Erica was there first, and I arrived just a few minutes before Cody, but Dan didn't show for a while. Just when we assumed he had chickened out, though, he finally came trotting down the path from his cabin. After a little bit of teasing, we decided that we should go ahead and get moving if we wanted to get back in time to catch a little bit of sleep. We had all brought flashlights, and Erica had brought her new camera, since she was going through a photographer phase at the time. The campground wasn't really that big, so we were able to make it to its edge on foot in just over half an hour. We hopped the ramshackle split-rail fence bordering the campground, and we could see the old farmhouse in the distance. There was just one problem. It was on the far side of a head-high cornfield. But, not willing to be deterred from our little investigation into the property, we made our way into the moonlit field. The corn wasn't quite ready to be harvested, so it was at least green and lush, not dry and creepy, and in the midst of the foliage, the air was refreshingly damp and cool as we walked. We whispered to one another about what we would do if we encountered the cannibal farmer, and we teased one another with pokes and prods, seeing who was on edge and jumpy. Finally, we reached the edge of the cornfield, and the terrain opened up into an overgrown grassy yard surrounding the single-story farmhouse and a run-down equipment shed. Rusted and neglected farm equipment lay scattered around the yard, surrounded by high grass and weeds, hay balers, box scrapes, cedars, you name it. The place definitely had the creepy vibe we were looking for, maybe even a little bit too much of it. We stood in silence for a moment. Then Dan and Cody both suggested we should turn back and return to the cabins, since we had seen what we came for. Erica was braver, though, and she said she wanted to get some pictures of the old shed and the farmhouse. Besides, she said, with a big full moon like that in the sky, I might actually be able to see some of these pictures. If I'm honest, I was feeling a little creeped out myself, but I didn't want to look like a coward, and since we had come all this way, I figured we might as well have a look around. We headed to the equipment shed first, immediately spooking a barn owl with our lights and all but dying of fright when it screeched at us. We poked around in the shed for a few more minutes, the beams of our flashlights casting terrible shadows as they shone across the rusted tines and blades of forgotten machinery. And then we began to move towards the dilapidated house. However, as we walked, we kept hearing a rustling sound, as though somebody was moving out in the cornfield. Every time we stopped to listen, the sound stopped too, almost like it was following us. Erica wouldn't be deterred, though, so we finally made it to the house. The porch was rotted and practically falling in, and attached to the door was a slip of bright orange paper encased in heavy plastic lamination. It read, "Notice of Eviction," and it was dated nearly a year ago. The door was sturdy and locked, and we didn't want to actually break in through one of the windows, so we circled around the building and looked for another way inside. By now, the pacing in the cornfield had stopped, so we could all relax a little, assuming it was just a raccoon or something similar. As we rounded the corner to the back of the house, we noticed that the storm cellar doors were wide open, so we figured that would be our ticket inside. However, when we reached the gaping entrance to the cellar, we were greeted with a less than welcoming sight. The concrete floor of the cellar was covered in animal bones and shredded skins. Deer, cattle, raccoons, dogs, birds, all skeletal, or mostly skeletal. Likewise, the thick wooden doors of the cellar were covered in scratches and claw marks, like something sharp had been scraping against them regularly. The grass around the entrance to the cellar was worn down, and the dirt was packed from regular traffic. Anybody who has worked in taxidermy or forensics will tell you that old bones have a very particular smell. It's not exactly the signature smell of death or the scent of decay. It's something else entirely, and that cellar absolutely reeked of it. The four of us stood at the entrance of the cellar, open-mouthed and shocked. We stood stone still, as though that would protect us from whatever it was that lived down there. Wordlessly, Dan and Cody backed away, as Erica and I shone our flashlights down into the cellar, looking for any sign that there might be something alive down there. We saw nothing, but the piles of bones and the claw marks on the doors were more than enough to persuade Erica that she didn't really need to get pictures of the inside of the house. We all quickly made the decision to go back the way we came, and we were debating if we should call the police, but then something stopped us in the middle of our whispered argument. A soft asterisk thud asterisk emanated from a rusted hay baler about halfway across the yard, and then came the sound of something sharp scratching against metal. All of us looked at one another, exchanging a wordless, "Did you hear that too?" look. We all shone our flashlights in the direction of the sound, and simultaneously we all saw it. There, atop the rusty green baler, was the shape of a large canine. It was far too big to be a coyote, and its fur was very dark. However, its outline wasn't quite right for a wolf either. Of course, it was hard to focus on anything except for its piercing yellow-green eyes and the carcass of the 2-point buck it held in its jaws. It didn't make any noise, no growling or snarling at all, but we understood the message it was communicating with its glare. Leave. And leave we did. The four of us all ran headlong, screaming into the cornfield, making a desperate break for the safety of the cabins. Just as I was running into the field, however, I looked over my shoulder, making sure that the beast wasn't following us. It wasn't, but when I looked back, what I saw was almost as unsettling. The thing had stood up. It was standing on its hind legs, now holding the deer carcass in its arms as it watched us leave. I only looked back for a second, but I know what I saw. After that, the whole memory is a blur. I returned to my cabin and bolted inside, and I remember seeing Dan and Cody running by as I was fumbling with the door, followed shortly by Erica. Suddenly, not feeling very grown up, I ran to my bed in the cabin and hid under the sheets, eventually falling asleep. The next morning, I wasn't even sure if everything from the night before was real or just a dream. However, when my cousins and I met up after breakfast, we all agreed that what we had seen was real. When I mentioned that I had looked back and seen the monster stand up, Dan and Erica suggested that maybe it was Bradley playing a prank on us, since wolves obviously don't stand on two legs. Except, Cody then told us that when he had returned to his cabin, Bradley had been sound asleep on the couch, and there's no way he could have beaten us home without us ever having seen him, running ahead of us. And where the heck had he gotten such an elaborate costume? Besides, even though Bradley was a pretty big guy already at 15, he's a 6'5" Marine nowadays for context. He definitely wasn't big enough to account for the height of the thing I had seen the night before. I don't know if any of you have ever worked with farm equipment, but a full-size round baler is a big piece of machinery, and this thing was more than half the height of the baler it was standing atop, making it easily 7 or 8 feet tall. I'm not sure what it was that we saw, but to this day, whenever I talk to my cousin Erica, the subject of that night almost always comes up. She still says her biggest regret is not stopping to take a picture of that basement full of bones, or the creature as it stood silhouetted against the brilliant light of the summer moon, but I always tell her that she did the right thing just running. The four of us have never told the rest of our family about our experience there, and the farmhouse and outbuildings have since been torn down. Most of my family from that area has either died or moved away now, so we don't have the yearly reunions anymore. But I'll never forget what I saw that night, and if I ever go back there, I'll be sure to be armed. After all, who knows if that thing is still out there? If you ever go out walking in the woods and farmland of the Upper Peninsula, take heed. There's something out there with claws, teeth, and a lot of fur. It walks on two legs, and when you meet it, it might be hungry.